those rich people always flying off somewhere.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Vegan Vanguard. I'm Mexie, and this is a show about a wide range of topics, just about anything we'd like to talk about, really, but always from a leftist, anti-capitalist, radical vegan, and just all in all, emancipatory perspective. So if you're new here, I typically co-host this podcast with my very best friend, Maureen, a privileged vegan. However, as I said last time, we had some timing issues for the last few weeks. So first, Maureen was in Spain attending a conference, and then I am going to be traveling this week to Europe for 3 weeks, also to attend a conference. And as I said last time, the last week of June, Maureen and I are actually going to be together for once in our lives in France together. So it's really exciting. But that meant that we had a few weeks where we just couldn't line up. So last week, I interviewed Josh Walker from the YPG about Rojava, and this week I have a wonderful interview with Becky Ellis, who is a PhD candidate in geography at the University of Western Ontario. We had a really, really exciting talk about bee decline and the whole Insectageddon crisis and capitalism and bee autonomy and multi-species commons. And I just found it all so fascinating. I think that you all are really going to like it. So get excited for that. I'm actually pre-recording this before I leave for Europe. So in case there's some kind of explosive reaction to my interview with Josh on Rojava, I'm not ignoring it. This has just been pre-recorded. So if there is that kind of reaction, I will address it in the next episode. But I have a feeling people are going to like that interview as well. So I'm just saying that who knows? Who knows what's going to happen within the next 2 weeks? So before we get into the episode, I would like to shout out Omar, who very generously increased their pledge on Patreon, their monthly pledge. Omar is a good friend of ours, so thank you so much, Omar. And if you would like to support the show, once again, you can sign up to be a monthly Patreon patron. I always confuse those words. On our website, veganvanguardpodcast.com, or you could throw us a one-time donation via PayPal, also on the website, or you could just share the episode with friends or family, or rate and review us on iTunes or whichever app you listen to the show on. So, without further ado, let's get into the interview. So Becky, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So excited to have this conversation. Okay, so first of all, just to start, could you maybe give our listeners a bit of background about yourself, just kind of introduce who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am a PhD candidate in human geography, and I'm studying the relationship between people and bees in cities, looking at both honeybees and native bees. Before I did that, I was doing various work in the community as a permaculture educator and practitioner. For a while, I ran a children's garden program. And before that, I did my master's in anthropology. So kind of anthropology is my kind of my background in terms of my training, about community gardening and the role that gentrification plays in community gardening. But I grew up on a farm, and I've always loved being around non-human nature and animals. We didn't have bees on my farm, but because I've always been someone who's been interested in growing my own food, I've always interacted with bees in that way in garden space. And I think when I really started to become more aware and concerned about bees was actually many years ago, probably 15 or 16 years ago, when someone in my community garden told me that her husband had killed a nest of ground nesting bees. And so she was like, so you don't have to worry, because I had little children at that time. And she's like, you don't have to worry, that the kids will be fine. And I was really horrified and upset that he had poisoned this nest of bees. Oh, wow. It was some sort of native solitary bees, but probably living in a group together. And I was really upset, and it shocked me that someone who was interested in gardening would kill bees that are actually quite helpful in a garden. So I think that's when my interest in bees and kind of realizing that some people are really uncomfortable with them and will kill them came about.
Yeah. And 15, 16 years ago, I feel like that was before kind of everything's been coming out of the news lately about bee decline, and there's this whole kind of panic about bee populations.
That was a little bit before that started happening. Yeah. So it was really, I think, around 2007 when in United States there was a huge loss of bees, of honeybees happening that beekeepers started noticing, that people called colony collapse disorder. And that particular phenomenon has died down, but honeybees face a lot of problems with their health, and then native bees are in quite a lot of decline.
So that kind of feeds into the first question here that I feel like generally the population is aware that bees are in decline, and that this could have a lot of bad implications for us because we need them as our pollinators. But I think that's where the conversation typically ends for most people. So I was wondering if you could explain a bit about why bee populations are in decline and what implications this will have for us.
Sure. So there are multiple factors in the decline of bee populations. So I like to think of it as non-honey bees, or I'll call them wild bees, are in decline in terms of their population across many species. And honeybees are in very poor health, I would say. And it's a lot of the same reasons why. So there is a problem with the way that industrial agriculture uses landscape. So monocultures of crops, most bees can't live very well with those landscapes. There's been a real increased use of pesticides. So there's one particular class of pesticide called neonicotinoids, which I know we'll talk about further, that are quite harmful to bees and all other insects. But also the widespread use of herbicides has killed off a lot of wildflowers in farming areas. And so that means that there's very little forage. So we already have, not a lot of habitat, not a lot of forage habitat, especially for wild bees. And then we have a widespread use of pesticides. There's also potential problems with climate change. And so unpredictable extreme weather can cause a whole lot of problems for both honeybees and wild bees. But wild bees in particular, some species of solitary bees have very special relationships with certain plants. And so they kind of time themselves when they emerge to emerge when those plants bloom. And if those plants aren't in bloom because the weather has been strange, then that can cause a huge problem in their population that year. And then the last thing is that there has been widespread spreading of parasites. It's especially true for honeybees. There's a lot of parasites and pathogens. Some of that can spread to wild bees. And there are also, on a very smaller scale, managed bumblebees used in greenhouses. And some of those bumblebees also have more pathogens and then escape and spread to the wild bumblebee population. So those are all the different factors. They interact with one another. There's been a lot of evidence that certain pesticides are harmful, but especially in relationship with certain other chemicals that bees would encounter. So it's kind of, in terms of pesticides and other chemicals, there's a kind of a toxic soup that they're encountering. And so it's a lot of problems. A lot of it comes back to industrial agriculture, although not entirely. And there's many potential problems with a decline in the bee population. So one thing is that it's not just bees that are in decline, it's most pollinators, if not all. And then also it's insects as a whole, group of animals. So there's been some recent studies, one from Germany, where scientists were looking at insect populations in a nature reserve over 30 years. And over that 30 years, they found a 75% decline in almost all insect populations, across all species. So, there's horrifying. So there's a really huge potential problem with insects as a whole group. And a lot of the same reasons why, I think. And so it's not just that, humans will suffer because bees pollinate about 30% of our food, and especially the food that gives us micronutrients that are really important for us to have, a really healthy, flourishing life. But it's also that bees and other pollinators pollinate about 87.5% of all flowering plants. So it's not just food for us, but it's food for so many other species of animals. And with climate change, so many species of animals are, suffering or on the decline. And so then if they have lack of food, that's just going to make things a lot worse for them.
Right. So this could have far-reaching implications across ecosystems.
Yes. Yeah, very far-reaching implications across ecosystems. So I think it's a really serious issue, and not just because, it threatens to impact human agriculture, but because it can really cause some ecosystem collapse.
Well, I'm glad to see that it's at least been in the news, right? People are at least waking up to it. But it seems like a really, really serious issue. So you write that in the context of wild bee decline, the use of honeybees in pollination can be considered a biological override to mask the accelerating contradictions of capitalist industrial agriculture. Could you explain what you mean by this and talk a bit more about the political economy of industrial beekeeping?
Sure. So my supervisor, Dr. Tony Weiss, has written a book and written a lot on this issue of the way that the accelerating contradictions of industrial agriculture. He talks a lot about industrial livestock agriculture. It's causing a whole bunch of problems, and what they're doing is they're having all these kind of overrides to deal with the problems, but then it's causing more and more problems. So he wrote a book called The Ecological Hoofprint about that in terms of industrial livestock agriculture, and we're working on a paper together about pollination and bees. So it's partly using his concepts and applying it to pollination and bees. And so basically, there's a lot of contradictions that emerge in the way that industrial agriculture uses pollinators or uses pollination. For, the whole existence of human agriculture, we have relied on pollinators, but a lot of times it was just kind of the pollination that happens in ecosystem. There's many different kinds of animals that pollinate, and it was something that was more mutually beneficial. So humans created landscapes that pollinators enjoyed living in, and enjoyed getting forage from, and then in return we got this great pollination of our crops. But what's happened in the past, 100 years is that industrial agriculture has really grown exponentially and really relied on these monocultured landscapes with a high input of pesticides. And this has caused some problems for the need for pollination. So you can have these monocultured fields filled with even something that animals pollinate, such as tomatoes. So bumblebees like to pollinate tomatoes. But monocultures are not great for wild bees, especially. So wild bees don't fly very far from their nest. Bumblebees fly a little further, but the many other kinds of wild bees that exist, so there's thousands and thousands in the whole world, they don't fly very far from their nest. So in a monoculture landscape, and especially one that's plowed and tilled, which they basically all are, they won't go very far. So they can't really pollinate those types of landscapes. And in monoculture landscapes, farmers also, try to eradicate all the wildflowers, the weeds. And so they do that sometimes manually by plowing or tilling, but often by using herbicides. And so there's actually no forage nearby either. So it's offering these wild bees very little habitat, it's offering them very little forage, and they generally don't thrive in those situations. And so in order to overcome that, what has really grown alongside industrial agriculture is this commercial beekeeping industry that offers pollination services. So when people think about beekeeping, they often think, well, the way that a beekeeper makes their livelihood is through the products of the hive, the honey and the beeswax. It's not true at all. Actually, the way they make their livelihood, large-scale beekeepers, is through offering pollination services. And that's partly because with this monoculture landscape, wild bees don't really exist very well in those landscapes, and so honeybees have to be moved in. And also when you have, with the almond crop in California, you have about 1 million acres of one crop, and it comes into bloom at the same time. And so not only are there very little native bees there, or wild bees there to pollinate, but you need a lot of bees. So actually the almond industry has become one of the largest industries that use honeybees as pollinators. So about 2 million colonies are shipped into California when almonds come into bloom. They're shipped there. They're there for about 4 to 6 weeks. And those honeybees are only getting food from the almonds. So their diet's not that great because it's not diversified. They might be exposed to some pesticides because mostly it's conventionally farmed almonds, and they have to be all shipped in. So they're shipped in from all over the United States on like huge transport trucks. And so 2 million colonies. Each colony would probably have about 50,000 bees. So that's many bees. And so that's one of the ways that kind of the industrial agriculture system has created, needs pollination. Then it's created this huge problem with not having enough pollinators in the wild. Then it ships in these honeybees, but then it's making the honeybees unhealthy. So there's been more and more studies, although I would say there are very few studies being done on the impact of migratory commercial pollination, the services. There's been very few studies showing the impact that has on the honeybees themselves. Some of the information we have is self-reported, voluntary, and as someone who has an anthropological background, the larger kind of enterprises or people with more power are less likely to kind of want people to know what their practices are, what's happening with them. So we don't have a lot of great statistics on the impacts of honeybees on pollinating landscapes like this. But what we are seeing is that, they have more stress that they encounter. They have weaker immune systems, more queen failure, more summer losses, it's unusual to have a summer loss of a honeybee colony, but they tend to have more summer losses because they're not as healthy at all. And so then it creates this other problem. And migratory beekeeping also potentially is spreading very rapidly a lot of these parasites and pathogens that honeybees are exposed to. So right now, if you were to ask any beekeeper what the biggest problem is when it comes to honeybees, they might talk about pesticides, but they will likely talk about mites, varroa mites, which is, a insect that in some ways can exist within a bee colony, but when there's too many of them, they can kill a bee colony. And right now, they're endemic to honeybees in especially North America, but also to a certain extent Europe. And it's a problem for small scale hobbyist beekeepers and a problem for the commercial ones. And, there's some evidence that, those are spread very rapidly, the mites and other pathogens that honeybees encounter, because bees are moved all across countries and continents even, which spreads them way more rapidly than they ever would spread in the wild.
Yeah. I find that just horrifying, personally. I don't know if you've seen the movie Terra. It's a documentary, this environmental documentary, but this is the first time that I actually saw what was going on in California with the almond harvest. And to get a visual of this is just really quite scary. And they actually showed that they were, bussing in all of these bees to pollinate. And I just felt just simply horrified. I guess because my background, I look at neoliberal conservation. So I feel like there's a lot of parallels in terms of these problems, or these environmental problems are caused through, capitalist processes. And then to solve them, instead of that threatening the viability of those enterprises into the future. They just find new ways to capitalize on the degradation. So we're going to capitalize on fixing the degradation in X, Y, or Z way, but it just keeps compounding the problem into the future, right? So it never really actually solves the contradiction. It just kind of postpones what's happening. And so now we have all of these industries that have so much control over these pollinators that are so important to us, and they are declining in health very rapidly. So how is this a sustainable model in any sense of the word, right?
Yeah, I would say large-scale commercial beekeeping is not sustainable at all, because then what they're doing, the really large-scale operations, is they are, treating the honeybees with miticides, with fungicides. They're using therapeutically antibiotics, which is, a huge problem when it comes to other farmed animals, the use of antibiotics in that way. And so then these miticides and fungicides are just adding to this toxic soup that honeybees encounter and making them weaker and, in even worse health. And then there's this huge industry that's growing with, the breeding and selling of queen bees, shipping queen bees all across the world. That's quite a huge industry with replacing colonies when they die. So, when a colony dies, then the beekeeper will quite rapidly replace that colony. And there's huge industry around that too. So all these industries have popped up. I find it disturbing. I'm a member of the Ontario Beekeepers Association. And they've done some great work on the banning of neonicotinoids. But sometimes you see like ads in them, and sometimes it's ads for different products used in the hive. And some of those, there was one in particular where it's an ad from, I believe, Bayer's Crop Science, who makes neonicotinoids, but, promoting something else that they were doing. And you just get this sense of how, especially commercial beekeepers, are completely embedded in this, industry that it would be really hard for them to, or if not impossible for them to get out of. And so a huge problem. And, then it causes this kind of antagonism to a certain degree between people who are advocates for native bees and people who are advocates for honeybees. You see that sometimes in cities where there's not this large scale commercial beekeeping happening, but where people are concerned that honeybees are driving out native bees, and looking at some of what's happened in the countryside. And I would argue, as someone who loves both, that it's these degraded landscapes that neither of these types of bees or any of these bees can flourish in, and that in many ways honeybees have been brought in as a rescue pollinator for the agricultural system, but that they are also suffering in it. And the decline of native bees, wild bees, has happened before honeybees are brought in like this. And so what we really need to do is change the types of landscapes we have. But of course, that's a really large issue of how do we change the whole capitalist industrial agriculture system.
Something we'll return to.
Yes.
So you just mentioned a bit about the political economy of, I cannot pronounce this, neonicotinoid pesticides. So how have companies played a role in dampening movements to legislate against the use of these pesticides?
So neonicotinoids have been around since about the mid-90s. So 1995, they've been introduced into Canada. Now they are widely used, especially on soy and corn. And as probably your listeners know, most of the soy and corn grown in the world, but most of the soy and corn grown in Canada is grown to feed livestock, so to feed cows and pigs and chickens. So it's not used directly to feed people. Sometimes people get confused, which is very unsustainable, and it's very annoying when people hear. You've probably had this happen, but people are talking about the problems with, for example, soybean agriculture, and they are kind of blaming like vegetarians and vegans. Like it's not being made into tofu. Like the soybeans in this area are not being made into tofu.
Right.
They're being made into food for cows.
Right.
But anyway, so now it's very widespread use. So about 90% of corn seeds are infused with neonicotinoids in Canada, and about 66% of soybean seeds. So it's very widely used. So neonicotinoids, they are systemic and persistent. So systemic means that the neonicotinoid can be found in all parts of the plant. So if it's infused in the seed, it will be in the nectar, it will be in the pollen, it will be in the liquid that comes out of the leaves. Persistent means that they persist in the environment. So they show up in the soil and they show up in waterways as well. And they're water soluble. So these are some of the issues. They're a neurotoxin, and that's how they kill insects, as you know, they're a neurotoxin. So they're very widely used. The main company that makes them is Bayer Crop Science, which is now coming together to merge with Monsanto. Yeah. So in Ontario, there was a lot of struggle and movement to have neonicotinoids banned. And that's been going on in Canada as a whole as well. And so the Ontario government in 2013 put together a working group, a bee health working group, which sounds great, except about 6 out of, I think it is 13 or 14 members were representatives of agrochemical companies in some way or another. So Bayer's Crop Science had someone in that working group. Syngenta had someone in that working group. There is a really powerful lobby group of agrochemical companies called CropLife International. So CropLife Canada had someone sit on the working group as well. So already you have 3 agrochemical corporations. But then there's a lot of different industry groups, and most of them are tied in some way to agrochemical companies, including some of the very large farmers groups. So Grain Farmers of Ontario also had a seat, but Grain Farmers of Ontario mostly represents very large scale farming businesses that are have, thousands of acres of corn and soy. And so, all these different groups had seats, and there was like one person from the Ontario Beekeepers Association, for example. So there's really one person advocating for beekeepers. There's one entomologist. So it was, I would say, very lopsided to agrochemical corporations, and they're looking at their own products to see if they're healthy or not, or should be regulated. And that working group came out with the idea that there should be some sort of temporary and voluntary, ban, but very temporary, very minuscule, very voluntary. Like the government should not be forcing anything on farmers. So it did not have very strong recommendations, and only about 2 of the recommendations that they came up with were actually something that would kind of move farmers more in an organic direction, with less reliance on the technology of these various corporations. So. I would say that was very much a weak working group because of who they brought in. And whenever, when the Canadian government is looking at pesticides to regulate and they form a working group, they are always bringing in industry. And, I guess they see that, we've got to consult with the players to make sure our industry thrives. This is why the government is a very contradictory kind of entity, because in some ways they very much want to see the capitalist system thrive. And so if that means that it's damaging, ecosystems and the ecosystem collapse, it doesn't seem to be high on the level of concern. So in spite of this, there was also consultations with the general public and with different groups, like the National Farmers Union, for example. So in spite of the recommendations of the Bee Health Group, they did decide to put a partial ban, and it was supposed to be up to 80% of neonicotinoid use would be stopped in the province. That came into full effect 2017. Unfortunately, the early numbers are that there was about a 25% reduction in use. And, that's fine, except these pesticides are persistent and systemic. So that's actually not very much. Even 80%, like a partial ban is not good because the way that this pesticide accumulates in the environment.
Right.
So it kind of needs to be a full ban, actually, in order to have a big impact. And there's some concern that whatever government we have in Ontario with the next election, that they will take away this ban. So it's a partial ban. It's not very strong already. The industry, agrochemical corporations are very much opposed to it. And so are these large farmers groups like the Grain Farmers of Ontario. And so there will be huge pressure if there's a conservative government to take away this ban that was already weak. So that's one of the ways. They also have front groups. So there is this website, really fancy, giving away packets of wildflower seeds. The website was called Bees Matter. It still exists. And some people on my Facebook were like tagging me in it because they know that I do a lot of work with bees. And they were like ordering seeds from this company, or it wasn't a company, it was a website giving away free seeds. They were ordering their free seeds. And when I looked at the website, I could tell pretty quickly that it was an industry website, because it talked about, we need farmers to have more forage, and we need more wildflowers, and you can do your part in growing them. But it didn't mention anything about neonicotinoids, or we need to lessen the use of pesticides, nothing like that. So that was one of the things that clued me off to the fact that it was an industry page. And then there was embedded, so you had to click on a whole bunch of things. And then it did say that it was, Bees Matter brought together all these corporations, and it was all, Crop Life International, Bayer's, Crop Science, Syngenta, Monsanto, so all these agrochemical corporations, but people had no idea of knowing. It just looked like a really beautiful, like maybe some sort of nonprofit is what people thought it was, giving out free packets of wildflower seeds. Right. So I couldn't like really tell. Something. Yeah, and then it was totally just an industry kind of front group. And it had information about how farmers are doing so much to help bees. And there is a bit of stuff like that where these large farming industry groups will talk about how farmers have planted so much wildflowers. But if they are also using neonicotinoids, then those neonicotinoids will be in the wildflower. Right. But the wildflowers are actually quite toxic. Right. Yeah. So it actually, if you want to help the bees and the farmers are going to plant a whole bunch of wildflowers, they actually have to stop using neonicotinoids. Yeah. I don't understand this partial ban, like what that would accomplish really, because as you said, they're persistent and it's already in so much of the soil and the flowers and everything. And so there's actually a huge problem with it showing up in waterways and then killing the insects, like the water kind of insects, and then leading to a lot of decline in bird populations. So it really does have to be a full ban. And then what people will say is that if we ban neonicotinoids, there'll be an even harsher chemical brought in, a harsher pesticide, which is why we really have to tackle the industrial agriculture system. Yeah, absolutely. It's horrifying. We're just going to kill everything. Yeah. And then hope that we can still survive. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Yeah, there's no future thinking, but this is so true for capitalism in general. Like when you talk about fossil fuel use and extraction, there's no thinking about the future impacts. No, it's just short-term economic gain. Yeah. Well, all right. So I was wondering if you could go into a bit more about the commercial honey production practices, because, we're a vegan show and we get a number of questions around honey. So is it really that important to leave out honey for practicing vegans? Of course, like on the show, we advocate veganism as a political stance and not necessarily just a consumption list. However, just wondering if you could explain the vegan rationale against eating honey from commercial beekeepers and what your thoughts are on that. Sure. So I do eat a little bit of honey from, sometimes from I don't really get very much honey from my bees, but sometimes from the bees that I share my space with. But if I do eat honey, it's from some sort of beekeeper I know, and I feel pretty comfortable with their practices. So commercial beekeeping, in my view, has a few significant ethical problems. So one is that they, like I said, widely use miticides, fungicides. And so the bees are actually in quite poor health, I would argue, have quite poor immune systems. It's compounding the problems that they're facing in the environment. I also feel a lot of the practices of industrial livestock agriculture that are really so problematic, where animals are, they're alive, they exist. I mean, we have more chickens on Earth than we've ever had at any time, but they are really unhealthy animals and suffering. And so I think that a lot of those same practices they're using in various ways in commercial beekeeping industries. So artificially inseminating queens, like that's really widespread. In the commercial beekeeping industry, they would not let a queen mate naturally, and they don't let bees really. They try to stop bees from practicing, or from not practicing, but kind of living out their normal life cycle. So they're really just being kind of used as a commodity, a way to, get pollinations, money for pollination services, products of the hive, but they're not being considered in terms of the way that they themselves want to live. They're not being let flourish. They're not thriving in commercial beekeeping. And, I think commercial beekeeping, the way that they're moved across landscapes, I think this is quite harmful to them. They have, diets that are really, really terrible, where they're, for 6 months only getting, or six weeks only getting nectar and pollen from one food source, and then they're packed up again and moved and only getting, then moved to another place where they're only getting one food source. So, I guess the main thing I would say is that they are very much in poor health, that they're not allowed to exercise any level of agency. And I would argue that bees actually have a lot of agency, that they want to exercise, and that, not letting them do that, not only is it, not allowing them to flourish, but it also causing a lot of problems, more a lot of large problems for, hobbyists and small scale beekeepers who might want to be more respectful of bees. So I think there are multiple compounding problems with the practices of commercial beekeeping.
I heard, I'm not sure if this is true, but I heard also that when they take the honey away, they replace it with some kind of sugar water, which is also...
and it's also very ironic, because we talk about these monoculture landscapes of corn and soy, and some of that is being turned into corn syrup, and some of that's being turned into soybean oil that's used, in processed foods. And so in commercial beekeeping, just a very common everyday practice, is to feed sugar syrup. I'm sure some of it is corn syrup, which is why it's kind of ironic. And pollen patties, which is often, I'm sure, also using soybean oil or different kinds of oil and proteins in there to give to the bees, and then to take their honey, which is their food source, and also to take the pollen as well. And so they, aren't even really being allowed to enjoy the things that they themselves are creating, which would help them to flourish more. There's also other practices, like bees collect resin from trees, and they make propolis, we call it. It's like a kind of glue, and they glue their hive together in various ways with it, but it also has some medicinal properties. There's just a lot of things we don't know. So it has medicinal properties. There's been some studies that have shown this, and that bees might use it to, if they have a particular problem with a particular bacteria, or even if they have some sort of weakened health in the colony for some reason, they might use this propolis as a medicine. And so beekeepers who are really concerned with managing the hive and making it really easy for humans to manage sometimes take away all that propolis, don't let bees have any of that, because they glue it, and so it does make it harder to work the hive. So there's just a lot of practices like that. So in commercial beekeeping, where they have thousands of hives, they are trying to make it as easy as possible for humans to get in there and manage. And so they're not letting the bees, do the things that they want to do for their own health. So those practices are very, very common. And then sometimes people who sell honey, take a lot of it and don't leave any for the bees, and instead give this sugar syrup, which has, none of the nutritional value really of honey. And there's a lot of things in honey antibacterial properties that we don't even fully understand, but that is obviously really important to the bee's health. And then when we take it and replace it with sugar syrup, we're not, we're not allowing them to have the kind of diet they need to flourish.
Right. And not allowing them to have any agency.
Yes, not allowing them to have any agency.
Yeah. So you speak a lot about the importance of bee agency and autonomy. So I was wondering if you could explain how bees exercise agency and what you understand bee autonomy to be.
Sure. So bees are a very highly managed group of animals, but they're actually only semi-domesticated. And this is because, unlike other animals used in the livestock industry, bees come and go, and they basically come and go as they please. And so they can really only be considered semi-domesticated. And there are various ways that they practice agency. And so I've been talking a lot about honeybees, but I'm going to incorporate some things about wild bees here too. So honeybees, they have really complex patterns of decision making. So, I think each honeybee in and of herself is amazing. But as a colony, some people talk about how they operate as a superorganism. And so the colony makes various decisions, and they make decisions in spite of their beekeeper. And so they make the decision, for example, to replace a queen sometimes. They can sense her pheromones if the queen is not laying very many eggs, and sometimes the bees decide that they need a new queen. It's complex decision making we don't fully understand, which is one of the things I love about studying bees. And so then they also sometimes make a decision to swarm. And swarming is reproducing on the colony level. So queens mate with various drones, and that's how she lays eggs and has new worker bees. But how a colony reproduces on the whole level of the colony is just swarm, and that's basically where half the bees and the queen will leave, and the other bees left will create a new queen. And so it actually has a really important function in helping to maintain a healthy colony, because what people are finding as entomologists is that honeybees, it's not just if they're too large and they're overcrowded, but if they have a problem with mites, for example, sometimes that's when they swarm, because the mites attack the bees in the larval stage. So it kind of breaks that stage for a bit. Neither queen is laying eggs for a while. So there's actually they're making a lot of really important decisions about how they want to live. And when they swarm, if anyone's ever seen a swarm, you have thousands of bees, maybe 15,000, 20,000, and the queen. They find a place to kind of rest. So be this huge kind of ball of bees. And then they send out a few scouts, and the scouts are going out and trying to find, a new place for them to set up their colony. And so the scouts will go to dead hollow trees. That's kind of the natural habitat for honeybees. They would go to all sorts of places, though, and sometimes people have honeybees that have set up in the walls of their house or their compost bin or all sorts of places, any place that's like snug and dark. And so they go out, they find different places, they come back, and they do like a bee dance, which is a way bees communicate, partly to kind of communicate to the other bees where the location is, and possibly, the different characteristics of what they found. And then the colony as a whole will make a decision about where to go. So which scout, found the best location, they think they'll go. There's a lot we don't understand to it. Wow. There's a great book called Honeybee Democracy by an entomologist, Thomas Seeley, and he talks about some of that. He studied that for many years. He talks about some of the ways that they make decisions. So, they very much decide where they want to live, the conditions under which they want to live. Sometimes when the conditions aren't great in a hive that humans provided, they start making plans to swarm. And beekeepers are, really skilled at finding those clues that they want to swarm and basically stopping the swarming or splitting the beehive. So kind of the beekeeper is kind of mimicking the swarming themselves. So And that's partly what, for some beekeepers, the practice of beekeeping is about. It's about looking for the clues from the bees, that they are, making various decisions about the queen or making decisions about when to swarm, and then trying to either work with that or prevent that. And so that's one of the ways bees practice agency. For wild bees, they set up habitat where they want. So wild bees make their home in the ground often, or in pithy hollow stems. And then some carpenter bees make their homes in people's sheds and fences and stuff like that. So wild bees set up their nests where they want to. They very clearly prefer to be autonomous from human intervention. They set up nests in places that can be very inconvenient for people. For example, on like a pathway where people are walking, they might, have their ground nest. And, that's how they flourish best, is when they're left to make their own decisions about where they want to live. So even when people who are very well-meaning put bee hotels in place, often you find that bees don't actually want to nest there. They want to nest instead in hollow stems of your raspberry canes. And so that's some of the ways bees practice agency. Sometimes they practice agency in just not pollinating the things that people plant and pollinating something else. I like the relationship that especially wild bees have with wild flowers, or things we might even call weeds. And that a lot of those plants flourish because they're being pollinated by bees. And, I feel like people could learn how to co-create with bees in their landscapes and accept the things that are flourishing and accept where bees want to live, instead of destroying those habitats and always trying to force them into human-made habitats instead. When people know I study bees and they ask me, for example, what to do about a carpenter bee nesting in their shed, I find it very hard to answer that question in any way that's satisfactory for the person, because I think, well, that's so amazing. There's a bee in your shed. Now you get to hang out with these carpenter bees. And really what they want to know is how to get rid of them, which I don't really have any answer to. I think that it's like living in space or urban spaces, like sharing space with bees is a really special thing. And every day can be amazing and full of awe if you really respect these animals, and accept the way that they want to live, and just learn how to coexist with them. So I think it's very clear, even honeybees who are highly, highly managed prefer to live without too much human interference. And there are some beekeepers that acknowledge that and try to respect that, by letting them live pretty close to the way that they want to, respecting the life cycle of the hive itself, of the colony itself. And then there are some beekeepers who definitely try to kind of stop all of that and make it as easy for humans as possible. Partly, commercial beekeepers, in some sense, to be a commercial beekeeper means you have to, because you can't have 20,000 hives and, be respecting the autonomy and agency of the bees. For example, bees would never ship across the continent. If they, they just can't. They can fly about 5 kilometers, that's their radius. So,
and they wouldn't be feasting on monocrops, or
they wouldn't be feasting on monocrops. So even honeybees who can, live in a monoculture landscape, because they do. That's not the best for them. That's not what they would prefer. They prefer polycultures, where there's a wide diversity of plants, is what, the vast majority of bees prefer.
So you kind of mentioned a bit about this idea of bee-centered beekeeping. So what would that look like in practice?
So bee-centered beekeeping, I, in that kind of category, include a lot of different types of beekeeping, and there's some overlap, and there's some that some practices that aren't similar to each other. But I feel like people are becoming more and more concerned about bees. A lot of the focus is on honeybees, although there should be even more focus on wild bees, because wild bees generally aren't managed in any way by people. So their populations are in decline, with nobody breeding new bees or helping them with that. So people have become increasingly concerned about bees. A lot of the focus has been on honeybees. And so there has been a resurgence of kind of what we might call hobbyist beekeeping. And there's been a real interest in that. And so, there are some people who consider themselves biodynamic beekeepers, who I would say have bee-centered practices, organic beekeepers with organic practices, and just some people who are really trying to be very gentle and mindful of bees. So what I would say bee-centered beekeeping is beekeeping where the beekeeper is trying to respect in some way the agency and autonomy of the bees and trying to engage in practices that are gentle and mindful of the bees and the life cycle that they want to live and the needs that they have so that they can flourish. So, I think some bee-centered beekeeping would be very hard to do on a very large-scale commercial level. And I think it's really this resurgence of small scale and hobbyist beekeepers who are practicing it in various ways. So some of the practices that might be associated with it are allowing queens to mate naturally. So it's actually very important because when queens, like a queen bee, when the colony decides to create a queen bee, it means that they take a larva that is going to be a worker bee and they feed it special things and they build a special cell for it and essentially turn it into a queen bee. And so the queen bee, she emerges, she unfortunately kills all the other queen bees that are in development, if there are any others, and she does really one flight in her life. And that flight is her mating flight. And so that's really the only time, unless she's swarming with half her colony, that she leaves the hive. And so, yes, it's a mating flight, and she goes and mates with quite a lot of drones and has a lot of genetic diversity in her body. She collects all the sperm that she'll ever need, and then she spends the rest of her life in the hive laying millions and millions of eggs. So the thing is, we don't know the benefit of that mating flight. It's not simply that she's going to mate. It's that that's her only time, in the fresh air. We don't exactly know what she does on her mating flight. There could be a lot of other benefits that we don't know of her having that flight. And so not allowing queens to ever do that and instead artificially inseminating her, that could have an implication on her health that we don't know. And there's actually been a problem with keeping queen bees alive for as long as they used to live. So they used to live 3 to 5 years, and now we're finding in North America that they're not living nearly as long and that they're suffering in various ways, and they don't exactly know why. And some of it could be that we're not, letting them have this mating flight, which could be a really essential part of their health and development. And also the swarm, swarming is this tricky issue because I think bee-centered beekeeping, allows bees to either swarm or to take the various steps that they take when they're about to swarm, and then the beekeeper would split right when they would swarm. Swarms are really interesting because they bring out a lot of fear in people, even people who are willing to live with bees in close proximity. A swarm is like thousands of bees at one time. And they can go anywhere. And so, in cities where there are, people with backyard bees, it can all be great and fine. But then when the bees swarm, that's when there could be more of a problem with neighbors or with, people in their community. But the thing about swarms is that's when bees are actually quite gentle. I would say honeybees are almost always pretty gentle, but that's when they're very gentle because they have no hive to defend. They are just like protecting the queen who's in the middle, but they're just like waiting until those scout bees come back and they find a new place to live. They're very actually chill and relaxed in a swarm, but just the sight of thousands of bees really scares people. And so for me, bee-centered beekeeping lets bees either swarm or lets them get to as close a stage where they would swarm as possible. I think swarms are really interesting because the bees themselves decide when to swarm. It's reproduction of the colony on the colony level. And a lot of times they're deciding to swarm for health reasons. And so if bees are suffering, honeybees are suffering because of pesticides and pathogens, letting them swarm when they decide, like trusting their wisdom of when they need to swarm is really important.
Yeah.
And so I think bees under beekeeping allows bees to do that. And, you know, other practices I would say is letting them have their own food, you know, letting them collect pollen and keep it, not giving them, you know, additional food unless they're about to starve to death, like in the winter, for example. Not taking any more honey than the bees need, like letting the bees have an abundance of honey and not taking any more than that. I think also really important practice for bee-centered beekeeping is to, you know, not move them over long distances. I think that very clearly that's a practice that's quite harmful to them, quite stressful to them. They would never move over those distances themselves. And so not doing that, just letting them be. And if they choose to move in a kind of a swarm, letting them do that by splitting or allowing them to swarm.
Right. You said that you had some bees. Do you do any hobbies beekeeping, or is that just wild bees?
No, I have. So I do have a lot of wild native bees that live in my backyard. But I also have right now one honeybee hive. So I do I would say bee-centered beekeeping. So when I do it, there's various things I do that I don't think all bee-centered beekeepers have to do, but I don't use a foundation and I let the bees build mostly the way that they want to. You have to, in Ontario, the rule is if you have honeybees, you have to be able to pull out the frames. So if you left them completely, they don't want anyone to take out any frames. So they would build in all sorts of ways. They're not at all, you know, they don't want it to be easy to extract their honey. But you have to, and partly we've created this problem of all these pathogens and pests. And so if you can't take out the frames, you can't check for mites and things like that. But I do let them build. So I just will have the frame with no foundation, let them build the way they want to. I don't introduce wax from other bees, which if you're buying it commercially could have a whole bunch of pesticides and chemicals in the wax, embedded in the wax. I don't really take any honey or beeswax. So when my colonies, there's sometimes they haven't made it through the winter. So, you know, it's important to say honeybees are not native to Canada. They're native to like the Mediterranean area of Europe and the Middle East. That's where they first originated. And so, you know, winters can be quite difficult on honeybees. And so if they don't make it through the winter, that's the only time where I've taken the honey and the beeswax. Other than that, I don't take any. I let them build the way they want to, let them have their own food. I think there's a way to I think about honeybees is if you give them more space, they'll build more honeycomb and they'll make more honey. So I think there's a way to take it to kind of gently rob them without causing them harm. But I just prefer not to. I like living with them in my space. I like watching them. They're really fascinating. And I do think that we can have a mutually beneficial relationship with bees. So, you know, we can see this really clearly with wild bees, where there are certain ways we can create landscapes that they really flourish in. And then there's things we can do to make landscapes that they suffer in. And so I think that thinking of yourself as a co-creator with bees, both honeybees and wild bees, you can create landscapes in which they flourish. And then in return, you know, they can help pollinate your food and your flowers and, you know, help create this abundance, which is good for people and is good for other animals and is good for bees. And so that's kind of the way that I like to approach my beekeeping and also the way that I like to approach my gardening as well. So it's really a co-created space.
I love that. We did a episode on domesticated animals, and we kind of talked about this idea of, you know, if the entire world went vegan, would we still have domesticated animals? And we thought that, I mean, I know that bees are only partially domesticated, but we thought that, you know, yes, not that we would have them, but that we would have symbiotic relationships with them. Like, we're not going to just have no relationships with other species around us. And that having those relationships, like, we have to examine the quality of that relationship or the foundation of that relationship. We have to examine that to make sure that it is, in fact, you know, symbiotic or mutually beneficial, whatever that means. But
yeah, I mean, I totally agree, because I think that humans and some animals have been living in very close proximity in relationship with one another for a really long time. And in some ways we co-evolved. And sometimes when people talk about that, they're talking about the animal changed. And there has been ways we have hugely changed animals and plants. But I think that humans have changed too. And I think that, humans really strive to have, I think we really want to connect meaningfully with animals. I think that the way we go about trying to do that can be really terrible, really short-sighted. But I do think that we need to have this sort of meaningful relationship with non-human nature, not just animals, but with other non-human natures as well. And that's really important part, I think, of being a person who is able to thrive and flourish. And so I think that, we would live in relationship with animals, but it would be in a way in which we are, I like to think about co-creating, but in which we're mutually flourishing. So humans and non-human nature are mutually flourishing together. A huge part of that, I think, is that, and this is really disrupting the whole, I think, way we've created our world right now. But this idea that any living being can be a commodity, is really problematic. You can't have a relationship that's not in some way based on exploitation if another being is a commodity. It's really harmful. And even with bees, like that, some of the practices associated with beekeeping are there because the bees are a commodity. And so, for example, if a beekeeper has 100 hives and they've put, a lot of money into those hives, they've bought those nucleuses, and if they let the bees swarm, the bees can go anywhere. And so if they're thinking about the bees as property, or if their bees swarm and then they have to replace them with other bees because they're getting some of their livelihood, like 100 hives, you just get the small part of your livelihood from the bees, then you're kind of embedded in this system where the bees are commodity. You've invested money into them. You can't let them swarm because you can't lose your investment. You can't lose your commodity. A lot of the rules around beekeeping in Ontario, for example, are rules about kind of keeping this semi-domesticated animal that can go feral, keeping it like in some way as the property of the beekeeper who owns them. It creates all these very strange way of relating to them, I think. And some, like, there's a rule, for example, in Ontario that you have to have 30 meters between your hive and anyone else's property line, which means that technically most urban beekeepers are, breaking that law. And it's the law, there's a lot of urban beekeepers, a lot of people breaking that law. People want to see it changed. And people are always like, what's the 30 meters? Like, that's 150 feet. Why was that chosen as a number? What I've found is that people don't really know why it's chosen as a number, including the Ministry of Agriculture. But one of the things could be that when bees first swarm, they don't go very far. So if they make it 30 meters, then they stay the first place that they land after they swarm, they still stay within your property. And you can get them back and they can be retained as your property. So it's this weird, it doesn't make sense. It's not about, what's best for bees. It's not about what's best for people. It's about this kind of bees as property. And so, I think no living being can or should be property of anyone else.
Property can never be autonomous. And without autonomy, then you're not actually having a mutual relationship. There's always that hierarchy and always that exploitation.
And there's some people that think of humans and non-human animals as an ideal would be that we live in entangled autonomy with one another. And I think that could definitely happen with bees, where we are sharing spaces with each other. Maybe humans are even getting a little bit of honey, but bees are kind of living the lives that they want to live, that they prefer to live.
Absolutely. So I think this kind of feeds into the concept of a multi-species urban commons, which you've talked about in some of your papers. So could you elaborate on the concept and how we might go about co-producing such a commons?
Yes. So the concept of multi-species urban commons is the idea that we can create spaces in cities and in countryside too, although I think it's a little trickier, in which people flourish and in which non-human animals flourish as well. And that we are creating spaces where we are respecting the right for other animals to exist in them and to flourish in them. And I think that when people talk about the commons and we talk about creating commons, so creating spaces in which mostly they're talking about humans. So creating spaces in which people can come together, they can share, they can cooperate, they can commonly own a place. It's really important and it's a really important process, but oftentimes animals are left out of that. But I think when we think about the commons, sometimes when people think about the commons, they're thinking about, pre-capitalist situations in which there wasn't a concept of ownership over land and people, came together and used land in various ways. But we forget that animals were parts of those landscapes too, and we're using those lands as well. It's important not to romanticize, I think, those societies, but I think, it is clear that before this concept of, land ownership, that people mutually existed with each other and with other animals in land where everybody was, thriving or flourishing depending on the conditions that they were living under. And so there's been a lot of people really interested in thinking about how we might recreate commons. We might get it back to some extent. And there's an historian, Peter Leinbach, who talks about the process of commoning, which focuses on, creating commons as a process of building relationships with one another. And so in that context, I think it's really great to think about the way that we might engage in commoning with non-human animals that focuses on building cooperative relationships with one another in which we all flourish together. And there's not necessarily a ton of models of that, but I think in some community garden spaces, I think in some things like public food forests, we do see people starting to do that. And some people might think it's very kind of strange because we talk about, creating a commons for people, and we talk about the process of commoning. A lot of times talking about radical democracy and engaging in creating, new institutions or new ways of interacting with each other based on this radical democracy. And then you think, how can you include non-human animals in that? And I think there's various ways you can. I think that, and that you should. So I think it's very clear that non-human animals are residents of cities, just as humans are. They participate in, creating landscapes and in changing landscapes. And so they're there and they're creating and they're participating. And so they should and can be considered when we are thinking about how to use those landscapes, how to create new forms of like community ownership or new forms of democracy. They can and should be considered. And it might not be that they're able to cast a vote or participate in a discussion, but we can clearly see, for example, we know about various animals, the habitats they want, the food sources they need. We kind of create those conditions in which they have access to that. And I think that we should, and I think that we should consider animals in the way that we create new forms of radical democracy in cities, especially in spaces in which the animals are already there and they're already flourishing. And so that's kind of what I mean by multi-species urban commons. And I think that people have become really interested in the potential of community gardens, of people coming together in spaces that are either publicly accessible or publicly owned, and deciding together that they are going to create something from that, that they're going to decide how this land is going to be used. They're going to decide what's going to happen on it. It can be really radical in this capitalist society where, every part of our life seems to be dominated by capital. It can be really liberating to come together and create these autonomous spaces that in some way get us a little bit beyond the capitalism. And including animals in that, I think, is it's really crucial. They're already there. And I think there's also various ways that urban animals change, like I've already said, they change city spaces, but I think there's various ways that they do express dislike or displeasure with certain things. And that instead of seeing that as the animal is the problem, seeing what we've kind of created in their spaces as a problem. Yeah. So insects aren't necessarily the best animal to demonstrate this, but some mammals really demonstrate this very well. Like they don't have access to enough great food sources. They're gonna overturn all the garbage cans at night and get the food that they need. Or humans create this square that is supposed to be pristine and clean, and then pigeons move in. And the problem is not the pigeons. Maybe the problem is creating these sterile landscapes that are so controlled.
Right. No, I completely agree. And I'm really energized by that idea of this multi-species commons. I learned a little bit about the idea of planning, urban planning that would incorporate the needs of animals in my master's. But yeah, I really love that idea. I feel like that's definitely something that we should be working towards. So you mentioned a bit about, the troubles of living within this capitalist framework. So do you think that creating a multi-species commons or respecting and making space for bee autonomy is compatible with a capitalist production of space or a capitalist food system?
No, that's a short answer. I don't think so. I think we can move in an important direction. I think that people really need to know that something exists beyond capitalism. Yeah. And I think if we don't have any of these spaces in which we're trying out these new ways of being together with each other and with non-human nature, then it really doesn't encourage people to think about what could be. Right. It doesn't have to be the way that it currently is. I think that I don't even remember who said this, but a long time ago, I read something about, one of the most awful impacts of neoliberal capitalism is that it steals people's imaginations and they're unable to imagine a different kind of world. And so I think the benefit of creating multi-species urban commons is that people can start to see glimpses of a different kind of world. We're interacting with each other and we're interacting with non-human nature in a way that is not based on, commodity, that's not based on capitalism, that is not based on exploitation and alienation. So I think people need to see glimpses of a better kind of world. And I think we also need to start building that kind of world, even though it will have the same contradictions and problems, or many of the same contradictions and problems that exist in broader capitalist society. Because I don't think it's enough just to fight against capitalism and the forms of oppression that come with capitalism. I think that we really have to think right now creatively about how, what we actually want to create, and then start trying to create that. With bee autonomy and agency, I think that, there are small scale beekeepers, very small scale, who are really interested in bee-centered, gentle beekeeping, and trying to practice that. But of course, they confront things that are completely out of their control. So, bees fly 5 kilometers. So, my home base is the city of London. 5 kilometers takes the bees outside the city. It takes them into fields of corn and soy. And actually, bees don't gather a lot of nectar and pollen from corn and soy. It's like a kind of like a desert for them. But, the wildflowers around those farms, I collect it. So even if I have this, area, I have this backyard that's filled with only organic plants and all this beautiful forage for bees, they're going to fly outside of that. And they're going to encounter these monoculture landscapes filled with pesticides. I don't have any control over that. Even in the city, some people are very committed to mimicking some of the worst aspects of industrial capitalist agriculture. So in some ways, a lawn is very much like a cornfield. It needs a lot of inputs. It needs, in order for it to be, I guess, pristine, green and lush, I guess, is what people are going for. They need to have artificial fertilizers. They need to have pesticides. Even though pesticides are banned in cities in Ontario, they're actually banned for use by landscape companies. So people can still go to the store and buy Roundup, which will kill, the clover and the dandelions that bees need. Yeah. They can still go to the store and buy insecticides and use them. And so, and it ends lawns. Like what people's ideal in especially a suburban area is to have this lush green grass. That is a desert for pollinators. There's nothing for them to get pollen and nectar from. Mm-hmm. And so, people are kind of mimicking, in a way, this monoculture landscape in cities. I don't think in a city like Toronto, I think there's a lot of people, gardening. There's a lot of parks with lots of trees and things like that. But in more suburban areas, this is much more of a problem, and it's much more of an aesthetic. Mm-hmm. And so that's another thing where you can be doing something amazing. You can have this community garden where people are coming together and creating this really amazing landscape for people and for insects and other non-human animals. Mm-hmm. But then, next door, there's someone who is using all these chemicals and really committed to their lawn. Mm-hmm. But one thing I think that's really important is that I think people really need to develop a relationship with non-human nature that is meaningful in order to want to change those practices, and also in order to want to confront, the agrochemical corporations and, industrial capitalist agriculture. Mm-hmm. If they don't have that meaningful connection with non-human nature, I don't think people are going to get to the point where they are willing to be engaged in struggles against this larger system. Mm-hmm. So I think that, these smaller projects, these smaller scale things can bring people into relationship with non-human nature in a meaningful way. And I think beekeeping is one way that can happen, because it's such a sensual experience and involves all your senses, especially when you're trying to practice very mindful, gentle beekeeping. Obviously there's a taste element when it comes to honeybees in terms of their honey, if you're tasting it, but there are smells, there's, the sound of their buzz, which can mean different things. If you're really attuned to it, you really get to know that it can mean different things about them. There is actually a beekeeper, he's a mentor in this beekeeping group I'm working with, and he said he can tell when a buzz means that there's something kind of wrong with the queen, that the hive buzzes differently. Wow. And he's really attuned to that sound. So, you can get really attuned, your body, like you make a very embodied experience where you're really tuned into the bees. And I think that that's a really powerful way of connecting with non-human nature. And then there's also the pain, like even that can when you do something to a beehive, when you're not being mindful, or you accidentally step in a bee because you just weren't watching your surroundings, that pain can jolt you into thinking differently about the way that you interact with insects. It can also, for some people, unfortunately, it makes them go out and buy a can of Raid or something. But for some people, it can make them much more mindful about the way they interact. So I think these projects that are encouraging people to think differently about the way they live with non-human nature and to think about themselves as being in relationship can be really important in changing people's perceptions. And my hope is getting people involved in struggle, because I think that we really do need to struggle against the larger industrial capitalist agriculture system. And so it can't just be these individual personal solutions. It has to be bigger than that. Right.
No, I really love that, because I talked a lot about, the importance of struggle, but then also the importance of prefiguring the world that you want to see. So I feel like in the leftist community, I guess, there's kind of this huge split between, the anarchist camp and the Marxist camp. And there's, so it's like either prefigurative politics or struggle against the system, right? And I think why not do both, at the same time? So, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read John Holloway. He wrote Crack Capitalism, and he kind of talks about that. He's a Marxist, but he's more of an autonomous Marxist, and Crack Capitalism is about, putting cracks in the capitalist system. So, he kind of likens the different ways of organizing or resisting capitalism to kind of, if capitalism's like this ice and you're like cracking it, and maybe sometimes it really takes off and like there's a break, but a lot of times it's these little cracks, and you don't know if the crack's gonna, get bigger or not. But these cracks are really important. They're all kind of weakening it. And so he has a lot of interesting things to say, but, one of that is that, even something that seems small and insignificant is put in a crack in the capitalist system. Yeah. And it could be that something that seems small actually, meets up with other cracks and forms a break. Like, we don't know and we can't really predict. And so I like that, and thinking about how these kind of small things like a community garden can have a bigger impact.
I like that too. I feel like it's hopeful. Right?
Yeah, it's hopeful. Yeah.
So I have one more question, and it's kind of a big one, but we kind of talked a bit about this idea of needing to, challenge the system. So I was wondering what you thought about, how this current concern around bees could be a potential jumping off point for building social movements that disrupt and build alternatives to this industrial capitalist agricultural system.
Well, one way I think is that people are really aware that industrial agriculture is the biggest problem for bees. So there has been a lot of concern about bees. A lot of it's focused on honeybees, which annoys advocates for native bees. But I think people are very clear, even with this whole kind of bees matter, this like industry lobbying and the way that they're kind of trying to save face. I think people are really clear that it is industrial agriculture. Because I do research with people about bees. When I ask people from entomologists to, someone who has a beautiful garden, what they think is the main thing affecting bees, basically everybody says industrial agriculture. So I think people are aware that it is the main problem for bees. And so I think that gives us, and it is the main problem for bees, and I think that gives us some hopeful ways forward for forming alliances. So one way is that there are small-scale organic farmers, who are on a global scale organizing. So one of the most prominent groups of small-scale organic farmers, or not all organic, but small-scale farmers, are La Via Campesina, which is a movement of mostly peasant farmers, many from the global south. But the National Farmers Union in Canada is aligned with La Via Campesina.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so obviously they're not peasants. In Canada, we have a different model of agriculture, but the National Farmers Union represents small-scale farmers. So they're not all organic, but they're all small scale. When people think about a farmer, they think about a family farmer. They don't think about these huge businesses, which most farms are. So National Farmers Union and La Via Campesina more broadly are bringing farmers and peasants together in, I would say, quite a radical social movement, one that sees industrial capitalist agriculture as a problem, one that sees politically organizing into a struggle, an international struggle, as a huge part of the solution, and they're doing so. And so it might be the kind of group of farmers aligned with that in Canada might seem small, but it's part of a larger international movement. And, I think that people who are bee advocates can form alliances with these farmers and peasants, and really struggling against the capitalist industrial agriculture system and trying to create a new form of agriculture. There's a lot of people, practicing agroecology, organic farming, organic gardening, permaculture, all these different ways where people are trying to create new ways of living with non-human nature and also making food for people. And so there's some exciting things being done. And then La Via Campesina is bringing people together and struggle. One of the ways that bees fit together really nicely into another prominent struggle is the struggle over the right to seeds and the right to save seeds, the right to have seeds under the control of people instead of in the control of corporations. So it comes together in that, these seeds that are infused with neonicotinoids also have all sorts of other problems. They're also genetically modified seeds, which means they have a patent. They're owned by these corporations. So causes a lot of problems for farmers, where farmers are embedded in this system where they can't save and control seeds. And that's actually on a global scale quite a large movement of farmers who want to retain control over seeds. And so I think that these two movements can come together. Another way they come together is in the solutions. So if we were actually to move to a system in which farmers had control over seeds again and people had control over seeds, communities, we would need, a ton of pollinators for that type of system to thrive. So there is a natural alliance there, because, plants don't form seeds unless they've been pollinated. And some plants are wind pollinated, but many are animal pollinated. And so there's like, they have a common enemy in a sense, the agrochemical corporations, but the solution is in common as well, is like this community control over our food, but community control over our seeds. Seeds that are not going to grow into plants that harm bees, seeds that are going to be able to grow into food, that can feed people, that can feed non-human animals, that can feed bees, or we can mutually flourish together. So I think that's one of the ways an alliance can be formed.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Livia Campesina. I shouted them out in my Radical Food Politics video. So if anyone has not seen that video, go check it out. But I also love that idea that, you know, there is kind of this common goal for both people and animals, right? So I like to talk a lot about how we need to start seeing animals as our allies because they don't have a stake in capitalism continuing, right? Yeah. Same with Maureen, a privileged vegan. She always talks about that, you know, animals should be considered our allies because we both have so much to gain from disrupting the system or overthrowing this system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that it's really important that we look to creating a food system for people that is socially just as well. And so that's what I love the work of Livia Campesina because they're, for example, very, very feminist. And I would say on a global scale, they're also concerned with the rights of farm workers as well. And so, you know, it can kind of bring us together in creating this food system that's ecologically regenerative, but that's also socially just as well, which I think is really important. And, you know, I think that it's important not to romanticize, you know, pre-industrial farming. There were, or beekeeping. There were a lot of problems as well. And so I think that thinking forward for one that's socially just and ecologically regenerative is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I guess that might be a good place to end, unless do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to add to the discussion?
I just encourage people to start thinking more about the insects they interact with. I think insects sometimes get neglected. You know, they're not considered like, for example, sentient animals, but they're pretty amazing. And I think once you start interacting with insects, you know, you learn a lot about the world and your surroundings that you might not know otherwise. And so I would just encourage people to, you know, spend some time interacting with a bee and watching her, it's probably going to be a her, watching her and seeing how she interacts with other insects, seeing how she interacts with you, see how she interacts with plants. It might bring you into a new kind of way of experiencing your relationship with the world.
Absolutely. So do you have, you know, social media or something? Can people follow you or your work somewhere? Or
yeah, I have a blog called Permaculture for the People.
Okay.
Because I'm also a permaculture person and really committed to a socially just, feminist, anti-oppressive permaculture framework. So I write a lot about bees and I write a lot about social movements, social struggle in the context of permaculture on that blog. And then I have a Facebook group, Permaculture for the People, and Permaculture People Twitter as well.
Okay, perfect. So we'll link all of those in the show notes so everyone can follow your work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful.